Hi, this is Andy Hoffman, Marketing Director of Miles Franklin Precious Metals in our 26th year in business. It's midday, Thursday, April 16, 2015, and the title of today's audio blog is The Death of Credibility. Now, per today's title, there are myriad places I could start, given just how many global leaders have forsaken their charges, neglected their political and social responsibilities, and ignored their fiduciary requirements, if not outright absconding with capital. However, given the Miles Franklin blog's mission statement, not to mention my personal expertise, I'm not here to comment on anything but the financial ramifications of such, which, for anyone with half an eye open to the world around them, realizes are at best devastating and at worst catastrophic. Essentially, the fraud mosaic built since the gold standard was abandoned 44 years ago, but more specifically, since this mathematically untenable system permanently broke in 2008, has been so broad it's difficult to find anyone unaffected by it. And sadly, we're still in the early innings, where, care of history's largest money printing, market manipulation, and propaganda scheme, the powers that be have managed to support the all-important financial markets, making the 1% vastly richer and enabling them to kick the can a few more miles. Just look at Goldman Sachs' earnings today, in which the government's top trading partner, which does nothing except trade with the government's free money and information and underwrite dot-com-like stock scams, was able to pay its average employee $382,000, whilst the rest of us deal with the lowest real household income in 4 decades. Outside the fraudulent money laundering, market manipulating, inside information trading canyons of Wall Street, London City, and a handful of other thief dens, the world is unequivocally at the economic low point of our lifetimes, and getting worse with each passing day. Go to King World News and view 6 of the most jaw-dropping charts of 2015, or Zero Hedge's 4 chartsmen of the recession, if you want a good view of the true state of the global economy. Or better yet, look up the prices of oil, notwithstanding this week's blatant oil PPT support, as discussed in yesterday's Liar King article, amidst exploding inventories, production, and production forecasts, as well as the plunging prices of nickel, iron ore, coal, lumber, and even rice. Even here in the United States of fraudulent recovery, where the Fed and its minions no longer have excuses other than the weather, despite said weather being warmer than average, data upon data are being characterized as, quote, the worst since 2008, such as this week's retail sales, housing starts, industrial production, and even Island of Lies data like the Empire State Manufacturing Index and weekly jobless claims, the latter of which is not only doctored, cooked, and otherwise adjusted beyond recognition, but has been rendered useless due to the new employment paradigm of consultants and part-time workers ineligible for unemployment insurance. Heck, the only government entitlement program that has seen significant declines in recent years is unemployment insurance. Not because people are getting jobs, but per the lowest labor participation rate in 38 years, and ever for males, more and more people are exhausting their benefits, which are now 99 weeks and counting compared to 26 weeks when I lost my sole job in 2005. And thus, according to the BLS, these people are no longer unemployed. Worse yet, the only non-waiter and bartender business that was actually expanding and paying high wages, i.e. oil and gas production, is in all-out freefall, while the only retail category posting actual gains is the so-called automotive sales from historical channel-stuffed inventories financed either by leases or the new and improved subprime auto fiasco that is already rolling over under the weight of declining sales. And last but not least, under the broad category of backdoor bailouts and entitlements are the exploding student loans, of which a significant amount are simply used to pay day-to-day bills, financed entirely by the federal government, which ultimately means printing press financed by taxpayers. Since the 2008 crisis, the student loan amount outstanding, due to millions of American youth realizing their job prospects are slim to none, has doubled from less than $700 billion to nearly $1.4 trillion. And as of today, a full 27% of these undischargeable loans for life are either delinquent or in all-out default. Last month, as part of the Democrats' blatantly transparent commencement of their re-election campaign, Obama actually proposed to make such loans to college-age men and women with no savings dischargeable in bankruptcy, which, if it occurs, will result in a multi-hundred billion dollar bailout and national debt increase, and an utter explosion of student loan applications seeking the essentially free printing press created money this group needs to survive. In response to said ineligibility to collect unemployment insurance, America has seen a cancerous meteoric growth in disability claims as hordes of people of all ages claim they are too sick or injured to work. In other words, damn the historical actuarial averages, as America has been inconveniently struck by an unfortunate tsunami-like wave of sickness and injury. Just watch Judge Judy a few episodes, and you'll see countless perfectly healthy looking people claim their income emanates from disability, and you can see just how easy it has become to exploit the expanding bureaucracy of the socialist states of America, which, by the way, is all but guaranteed to eventually be paid for with European and Canadian style tax increases. Oh, and by the way, the government's disability trust fund has become so overburdened by claims, it now has just 2 years' worth of funds left. That is, if you exclude the unlimited funds Whirlybird Janet's printing press will inevitably be asked to conjure up. Yes, the Fed's printing press, which America's newest capitalist, Ben Bernanke, claims he was courageous to use in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis that he helped to create and failed to predict. And speaking of Helicopter Ben, what better epitaph for the serial economy killer than this morning's news that, to quote Zero Hedge, Bernanke joins the world's most leveraged hedge fund, high-frequency trading powerhouse Citadel. Yes, Citadel, which is one of the most vilified financial whorehouses in the world due to its excessive use of high-frequency trading, is now the employer of the man who built the world's largest hedge fund, i.e., the Fed's 50 times leveraged $4.5 trillion balance sheet of high-duration, historically overvalued Treasury and mortgage bonds, whilst relentlessly speaking of the mythical exit strategy that can never ever occur. And by the way, when my good friend Wister Holt, a former GATA board member, exhaustively investigated the naked shorting of his mining stock portfolio perhaps a decade back, guess which hedge fund showed up more than other in its time and sales research? And this before I had even heard of high-frequency trading, which, by the way, was officially endorsed by the SEC today, despite their pathetically transparent anti-HFT rhetoric, principally around Michael Lewis's book, when one of the most sinister market manipulators of all time, Virtu, was allowed to go public this morning. Virtu, which arrogantly claims to make money with proprietary HFT trading every day, is the only firm outside too big to fail insiders like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan to make such claims, which invariably are based on a combination of government-sanctioned fraud, theft, and amorality. Fortunately, these financial mobsters can't manufacture physical gold and silver or prevent the explosion of demand and collapse of supply that will ultimately overwhelm them. Back to the rest of the world that the vast majority of secular Americans could care less about, 2008 is unquestionably viewed as the good old days in terms of economic activity, pricing power, debt accumulation, and business sentiment. Not to mention purchasing power, as the average currency is down roughly 40% against the reserve currency in just the past 3.5 years alone, i.e., when the world's largest central banks, led by the Fed, commenced their hideous, world-destroying QE, ZERP, and even NERP schemes. It was then, in mid-2011, which I have since deemed the point of no return, when said financial leaders realized the post-2008 liquidity tsunami was failing, and thus the only way to rectify the situation was to not only double, triple, and quadruple down on the money printing, but literally take over every material financial market. Most importantly, stocks, bonds, and precious metals. Unfortunately for them, they not only have been unable to prevent said implosion of global economic activity, but made it far worse due to the massive amounts of debt incurred by sovereign nations and central banks alike, let alone municipalities, individuals, and corporations, the latter of which often did so to buy back shares and enrich the 1% further at the expense of the economy, the various companies' future, and of course the 99% that first lose their jobs and then are forced to bail the companies out. To wit, the technology company SanDisk, which last night reported miserable earnings and a 5% reduction in global headcount. But don't worry, shareholders, as they also plan to increase their stock repurchase program by $750 million, no doubt advised by a company like Goldman Sachs, which, by the way, in what is perhaps the most damning statement as to just how low America has sunk and just how commandeered its economy and financial markets have become, Goldman Sachs is now the most heavily weighted stock in the price-weighted Dow Jones Propaganda Average. Previously, another company that not only is not industrial, but symbolizes exactly what America's economy has become, had the top slot. However, when Visa split its stock, Goldman Sachs took the lead. And by the way, before Goldman Sachs and Visa, the Dow's top stock was IBM, once one of America's greatest companies, but now a bankruptcy in waiting for all the reasons cited above, such as technological obsolescence and the forsaking of capital spending in light of the same debt-financed equity buybacks that have failed to support SanDisk's stock price. Speaking of the massive accumulation of sovereign debt and the role America's leading companies had in enabling it, what better to discuss than the financial system's top near-term risk, which, more than 2 years ago, I deemed most likely to catalyze the big one. Yes, Greece, which, contrary to my unwavering Grexit-guaranteed stance, has been largely ignored by the evil troika of Washington, Wall Street, and the MSM. In part, I surmise, due to a belief that the ECB's whatever it takes QE program will be able to monetize whatever Greek bonds and the associated derivatives that are not nailed down, and in doing so, preventing the total loss of confidence in the euro that could lead to its demise. Let alone as a Greek default of up to 400 billion of debt, largely to European creditors, will likely yield an explosion of parallel, already burgeoning movements in Spain, Italy, France, and for that matter, all nations seeking to get out from under the odious debt, to use an international law term defined as debt incurred contrary to a nation's best interests. Of course, the other reason such horrifying issues, which back in 2011 nearly took down the entire system and forced Mario Draghi to claim he would do whatever it takes to save the euro, ironically by diluting it, is the unprecedented hubris of central bankers actually believing they've usurped economic Mother Nature with the modern weapons of mass destruction that have temporarily commandeered financial markets, from stocks to bonds, selected commodities, and of course, precious metals. Yet, as discussed above, economic Mother Nature's relentless armies are rapidly advancing, and if anything presages what the near-term future will likely look like, it was yesterday's attack of Goldman Mario himself at an ECB money-printing meeting by a bystander screaming the ECB is an illegitimate dictatorship. Anyhow, since the farcical 4-month extension of Greece's $200 billion plus of bailout liabilities was agreed upon in February, after which we learned it turns out the so-called reforms the extension was based upon were written not by Greeks, but the Eurogroup itself. This comical list of ambiguities could have just as easily been written by a 3-year-old whose only defense tactic is saying, "I'm sorry." And since then, the Troika, now euphemistically called the institutions, have given Greece 3 separate deadlines to expand on them. Well, it turns out they again ignored this request, prompting Germany's finance minister to say this morning that there's not a chance Greece will receive more funds at the supposedly all-important Eurogroup meeting next Friday. And what's this? Just this morning, we learned that Greece has not only hired a famous sovereign debt lawyer, but actually asked the IMF to extend the deadline for the measly 750 million euro interest payment Greece owes it next month, which, as I noted earlier this week, was the amount the Fed printed every 12 hours for the 22 months of its QE3 monetization scheme between December 2012 and October 2014. In other words, as symbolized by today's explosion of Greek bond yields to multi-year highs and PIGS yield spreads to multi-month highs, Grexit and default are now more likely than not likely within the next few months. Heck, even a famous European financial betting company stopped taking Grexit bets this morning, given how inevitable and perhaps imminent it appears to be. Yesterday, the moronic MSM claimed gold higher on Greek fears, despite the fact that such fears have been prevalent for months, let alone a myriad of other massively precious metal bullish factors, from collapsing global economic data to surging foreign sales of U.S. treasuries to exploding Chinese and Indian gold demand. And yet today, following a spate of horrible economic data and the aforementioned news that Greece asked the IMF to delay its scheduled repayment, gold's rally was stopped cold at the same 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time key attack time number 1, marking the close of global physical trading that we have observed for the past 15 years. And this with the dollar actually falling and stocks recovering their losses in prototypical dead ringer algorithm fashion, no doubt aided in some way, shape, and form by the fabulously wealthy, infallible traders at Goldman Sachs and Citadel. And take a wild guess what price gold was taken below as a result of this farce. Yup, the same $1,200 line in the sand below which the vast majority of global production is unprofitable, that the cartel has been violently protecting for the past 6 months. All that said, it's time to get to today's principal topic, i.e. the death of credibility that global politicians, corporations, municipalities, and most of all central bankers is occurring right under our noses. Remember, the only thing holding a Ponzi scheme together, aside from fraud, of course, is trust in the underlying entity. And in the case of history's largest and only global fiat currency Ponzi scheme, the global currency collapse that started in 2011 and accelerated last year couldn't more obviously signify that said credibility of the entities maintaining it is rapidly dying on the vine. Not that I haven't written of and discussed such topics ad nauseum, but clearly as the global economic implosion has accelerated, and with it myriad commodities, currencies, and social structures, said powers that be, their ability to defer such fears with propaganda is failing. And nowhere more so than the Fed, where the blithering idiot helicopter Ben Bernanke, who told Congress gold was not money and 60 Minutes that QE3 was not monetization, was replaced by an even worse actor, if that was in fact possible, in whirlybird Janet Yellen. Never have Fed governors been called on to make more speeches, including the 5 scheduled today, in which for the most part they are mandated to keep us off balance by alternatively speaking of potential rate increases, rate cuts, and other potential monetary policy adjustments, as if anything they've ever done has worked or anything they've ever predicted come true. Other than to create historic financial bubbles, unprecedented economic deformation, see last week's 2 articles and 1 audio blog on this topic alone, and of course the global currency volatility and in many cases collapse that expands with each passing day. There's a reason recent post-FOMC audio blogs have had names like New Lows of Fed Idiocy and Cluelessness, the most unequivocally dovish FOMC statement in memory, the Fed flat out lied and everyone knows it, FOMC lunacy opens the gates of financial hell, and laughable FOMC statement sets new lows for central bank credibility until the Swiss National Bank one-ups it. And from what I'm observing this week alone, this trend is only intensifying. From the Bank of Japan's pathetic jawboning of how 120 yen to the dollar is low enough, to the ECB's blatantly leaked rumors of a potential early end, to the 20-month QE program that started last month, and this with the European economy in free fall and Greece about to default. Last but not least, the various Fed governors contributing to said chaos with completely contradictory statements. Last week, Minnesota Fed President Narayana Kocherlakota said, "There's a case to be made for more QE now." And 1 week later, after a spate of horrific across-the-board economic data, the FOMC's token hawk, Jeffrey Lacker of the Richmond Fed, was trotted out to say yesterday, "Indicators point to the need to raise rates this year, and I'm undeterred by recent weakness in data, which can't go on forever." Really, what indicators suggest a need to raise rates, particularly as the entire world is stuck to the zero bound, and some lower, whilst America has more debt than most of these countries combined? And if recent data has been weak, I'm even more baffled as to what indicators he is noting. Could it be the weather, which was mentioned a whopping 71 times in yesterday's Federal Reserve Beige Book of ambiguous qualitative data, which somehow has been blamed for first quarter economic weakness, even though it was above average for most of America? Not to mention that the weather effect is maniacally seasonally adjusted from economic data every year, which is why until last year, first quarter GDP reports were no lower than the other 3 quarters. Then we have yesterday's simultaneous comments from one of the FOMC's most notable idiots, regional presidents, i.e. James Bullard of the St. Louis Fed. In a few short bullet points, he managed to not only contradict himself and massively violate the new Fed's supposed insistence on transparency, but managed to demonstrate just how clueless the Fed's prophets and seers are. First, he claimed, now may be a good time to begin interest rates. However, the Fed should not surprise markets in doing so, and moreover, he intends to be deliberately vague about liftoff timing. Ugh, there's that liftoff word again, which per last week's audio blog of the same title, is the hands-down winner of the 2015 Propaganda Buzzword of the Year Award, following in the footsteps of 2012's recovery, 2013's tapering, and 2014's de-escalation. And last but not least, Bullard uttered the ultimate idiocy, This coming, you recall, from the man who supposedly saved a temporarily falling stock market on October 16th, just 13 days before QE3 was officially ended, by claiming a logical policy response at this juncture is to delay the end of QE. Yes, James Bullard, charged with printing the nation's money and holding the economic fate of billions in his hands, who is supposedly one of the smartest economic minds in the world, lol, actually said, after liftoff, we could cut rates again if the economy suffers an economic shock. Yes, my friends, listening to this audio blog on essentially every continent but Antarctica, this is how idiotic and clueless, per the title of the aforementioned audio blog, our Federal Reserve leaders are, and subsequently, how guaranteed it is that their previous catastrophic failures will be massively compounded by incremental policy, no matter what it turns out to be. As if any other alternative is even possible in a fiat Ponzi scheme, much less history's largest, which is objectively in its terminal stage. And last but not least, comments from the ground zero of all central bank evil, i.e. the New York Federal Reserve Bank, where not only the Fed's ZIRP and QE operations, both overt and covert, are conducted, and advertised, by the way, but likely the stock PPT, oil PPT, exchange stabilization fund, gold cartel, and all other manipulative operatives imaginable. Heck, the New York Fed considers its world-destroying manipulation operations so sacrosanct, they actually publicly disclosed this week that they are expanding their recently opened Chicago satellite office due to, quote, wariness that a natural disaster or other eventuality could shut down its market operations as it approaches an interest rate hike. Gee, I wonder what eventuality they could possibly be worried about, like, for instance, crashing stock and bond markets or rising precious metals. And if they're that worried about a possible, potential quarter-point rate hike from zero, just think what kind of eventualities might occur if something actually bad happened. To that end, it was just a week ago when I penned Fed Transparency Revealed from Mr. Goldman Sachs himself, referring, of course, to New York Fed President William Dudley, who, prior to his appointment in 2009, spent 2 decades as chief economist of none other than Goldman Sachs. In a speech just 9 days ago, he blew away James Bullard in the Purposeful Ambiguity Department, claiming, a mere 4 days after the worst NFP employment report in years, the Fed will begin rate hikes if the labor market continues to improve. And mere days after the biggest CPI decline in years, not that it reflects the soaring costs of living of average Americans, the Fed will increase rates if it's reasonably confident inflation will rise to its 2% goal. He then transitioned to the aforementioned statistically disproved catch-all excuse that delaying rate hikes with surprise recent weakness reflects mostly temporary factors, including a harsh winter, before moving into the hyper-dovish realm of the Fed expects its path of policy tightening to be relatively shallow. The Fed expects to see wage growth, but soft March jobs data sows caution. The drop in the oil industry will exert a meaningful drag on economic activity, which, of course, completely contradicts Janet Yellen's recent comments that not only were falling oil prices transitory, but a net positive for the economy. Then he goes on to say, low oil and a strong dollar pose risks to the U.S. economic outlook, which is exactly what I said 2 months ago and what the White House repeated a month ago. And last but not least, the timing of rate hikes is uncertain due to risks to the economy. In other words, the perfect mix of lies, deceit, dovishness, and hawkishness, top off only by the standard boilerplate comment that, despite not a shred of evidence supporting it, the Fed is confident it has the tools to effectively tighten policy. Quite astonishing and terrifying to read, given that the New York Fed's importance and market power exceeds that of any financial institution on the planet. Clearly, the world faces a tragic case of the blind leading the blind, which, per this morning's New York Fed follow-up, worsens with each passing day. To wit, said William Dudley gave a resounding warning about the potential wave of municipal bankruptcies I discussed last week, of which, according to him, the New York Fed is committed to playing a role in ensuring the stability of this important sector, i.e. another major taxpayer-funded printing press finance bailout is on the horizon, as on the state level alone, the average state has just half the currency reserve level of 2008, when the entire financial system nearly collapsed in an economy far better than today. But don't worry, a New York Fed underling named Simon Potter was given permission to interview with none other than head MSM propagandist Yahoo Finance, in which, after being introduced as the man who, quote, leads the team that will be responsible for hiking rates, he arrogantly stated, again based on nothing more than a, quote, lightly tested tool with no real market experience, that he is, quote, confident the Fed can smoothly raise rates when the time comes. Yes, just like Alan Greenspan was worried about irrational exuberance in 1996, but not enough to do anything about it. And Ben Bernanke was confident in 2007 that the problems in the subprime market seem likely to be contained. Well, that's enough for today. As I told my wife this morning, the free-flowing and long nature of audioblogs is extremely mentally draining. Believe me, I could write another 5 pages if required, but suffice to say, what I've written to this point should be more than enough to get you running, kicking and screaming, to Miles Franklin's team of precious metal experts. To that end, if you decide to take action before the inevitable endgame precludes this opportunity, let alone at today's ridiculous prices below the cost of production, by buying or storing precious metals, we hope you'll call Miles Franklin at 800-822-8080 and give us a chance to earn your business. And as always, I can be reached via email at ahoffman@milesfranklin.com. Thank you.